Imagine a woman sitting alone in her car in a parking lot. She has been there for a while, phone in her hand, a message open on the screen. She is not confused about what it says. She understands it perfectly, but she is not replying. Not because she is unsure, not because she is busy, but because something inside her has shifted. For the first time in a long time, she has no urge to respond at all. And that silence scares her more than the message itself. It is not dangerous. It is not threatening. The fear comes from something deeper. She suddenly notices something about herself she has never fully faced before. The part of her that always rushed to respond, to fix, to care, to show up, is quiet. And without it, she doesn't know who she is. If you've ever felt that strange stillness, that moment where your usual emotional reaction just doesn't activate anymore, then you know this feeling. It is not emotional damage. It is not collapse. It is something far more important. It is a shift in how a person is built on the inside. To understand this, you have to understand what people really mean when they say empath. It is often described as someone sensitive, someone who feels deeply, someone who absorbs the emotions around them. But the real pattern goes deeper than that. An empath is not just someone who feels more, it is someone who builds their identity around responding to others. Their sense of value comes from being needed, their sense of belonging comes from being available, and their version of love becomes tied to fixing, supporting, and carrying others emotionally. This usually doesn't start randomly. It often forms early in life, in environments where love was inconsistent or conditional, where staying aware of other people's emotions was not optional, it was necessary. It became a way to stay safe, to stay connected, to avoid conflict or rejection. Over time, it stops feeling like a learned behavior and starts feeling like personality. They don't think about it, they just do it. Being there for others feels natural. Saying yes feels automatic. Putting themselves last feels normal. And for a while, it seems to work. People appreciate them, they rely on them, they become the strong one, the understanding one, the always available one. On the surface, it even feels like love and connection. But slowly, something changes. A deeper exhaustion sets in. Not physical tiredness, but emotional depletion. The kind that sits in the chest. The feeling of giving and realizing it never really fills anything back up. And then comes the quiet realization the care was not balanced. It created expectation, it created dependence, it created a role where they were always the giver, never the receiver. At some point, something inside them starts to shift. They begin to observe instead of immediately react. They start noticing patterns they ignored before. Who only appears during crises, who takes but rarely gives, who keeps them emotionally close just enough to maintain access but never truly meets them halfway. For the first time, they see it clearly, not emotionally, but honestly. And this is where people often misunderstand what happens next. They assume this withdrawal is emotional shutdown or coldness, but it is not that. What is actually happening is a deep psychological adjustment. Their sense of control starts to move inward. Before, their emotional state was controlled by others, what people felt, what people needed, what people expected. Now that starts to change. They begin to separate what is truly theirs to carry from what never was. They stop taking responsibility for emotions that don't belong to them. They stop treating other people's chaos as their duty to fix. And that change feels intense because it rewires how they relate to everyone around them. But it is not destruction, it is clarity. And once that clarity begins, nothing feels the same again. Because once you realize how much energy you've been spending trying to fix things that were never actually yours to fix, another question naturally shows up. What could my life feel like if I stopped giving all of that away? What would I do with myself, with my focus, with my energy, if I actually kept it? And that question quietly starts to reshape everything from the inside. But there is something important that has to be understood here before anything else makes sense, and that is guilt. If you skip over this part, the whole process feels wrong instead of real. Because this change does not feel like relief at first. It feels like something is breaking. It feels like you are becoming a bad person. It feels like you are doing something selfish, even when you are just trying to breathe. There is a voice that has lived inside this kind of person for years. A voice built from identity, habit, and survival. It says things like you are being selfish. It says people depend on you. It says you are abandoning others. It says your value comes from being the one who stays, who understands, who holds everything together. And when that voice is strong enough, those thoughts don't feel like thoughts. They feel like truth. They feel like responsibility. So even when the person starts choosing themselves, even when they start protecting their energy, there is guilt sitting in the background, insisting they are doing something wrong. That is what makes this stage so difficult, because you are not just changing behavior, you are questioning your entire sense of goodness. But if you look closely at where that guilt comes from, it is not really about the present. It is built from the past. It is old conditioning. It comes from a time when paying attention to other people's emotions was not optional. It was necessary. It was how safety worked. It was how connection worked. Over time, that survival strategy turns into belief. The belief that your worth depends on how much you give, that love has to be earned through effort, that you have to keep producing emotional support in order to deserve your place in people's lives. So when you finally start pulling back, that system reacts. It creates guilt to pull you back into the old pattern. Not because it is right, but because it is familiar. And when you understand that, something important changes. The guilt does not vanish instantly, but it stops being an instruction. It stops being a verdict about who you are. It becomes a signal. It shows you where old wiring is still active, where old fear is still speaking. During this phase, something else happens too. Psychologists would describe it as a kind of internal reorganization. The old identity starts to loosen. The version of you that was always available, always giving, always holding everything together begins to fade. And before something new fully forms, there is an in-between space. It feels uncertain. It can feel empty. Sometimes it feels like you are not fully yourself anymore, like you are observing your own life instead of fully living it. There can even be grief in that space. Because even though that old version of you was exhausting, it was familiar. And the mind confuses familiar with safe. So letting go of it can feel like loss, even when it is actually release. What comes next is where things begin to shift in a visible way. One of the first changes is communication, or more accurately, what stops being said. People who have lived in this pattern often explain everything. They don't do it because they are weak, but because they believe understanding will fix things. They believe if they explain clearly enough, kindly enough, deeply enough, the other person will finally understand and respond differently. So they talk, they clarify, they over-explain. They add context, emotion, patience, and softness even when they are the ones being misunderstood. But at some point, something becomes clear. Not everyone is confused. Some people are choosing not to see, because seeing clearly would require responsibility. It would require accountability. And that is something they are not willing to carry. So instead of understanding, they argue. Instead of reflecting, they deflect. Instead of changing, they stay where they are. And all that explanation gets turned into more confusion, not clarity. And eventually, something inside shifts. She stops explaining. And the silence that follows is not emptiness. It is awareness. It is restraint. It is the decision to no longer keep offering clarity to people who benefit from misunderstanding her. Because when your default has always been to reach out, to explain, to repair, choosing not to do that is not withdrawal, it is self-respect. It is learning that not every connection is meant to be fixed, and not every misunderstanding deserves your energy. The silence does something else too, something she does not expect at first. It starts to clarify people, because when she stops explaining herself, when she stops over-justifying her feelings, when she stops filling every gap so others can understand her perfectly, something becomes very visible very quickly. Some people were listening because they genuinely cared. They were trying to understand her even when she wasn't perfect in how she expressed herself. They didn't need everything spelled out. They adjusted, they stayed present, and then there are others. The difference becomes obvious in the absence of her effort. Those were not really listening to understand her. They were listening to manage her, to respond to her, to use what she said, shape it, or keep control of the situation through it. And that realization can hurt, but it is also clear. And at a certain point in life, Clarity becomes more important than comfort. Now, it is important to understand what detachment actually feels like, because this word is often misunderstood. People imagine detachment as shutting down emotionally, becoming cold, building walls, or no longer feeling anything at all. But that is not real detachment. That is emotional shutdown. That is distance created by overwhelm or injury. True detachment is something very different. It is not absence of feeling. It is change of position. It feels like standing inside a room and then stepping outside of it, still able to see everything clearly, still aware of what is happening, but no longer trapped inside the intensity of it. The emotion is still visible, but it is not controlling her anymore. It is not pulling her into reaction. She is still aware. She is still emotionally intelligent, but she is no longer being carried away by every wave of someone else's emotional state. And that shift changes everything about how she sees reality. Because when you are not inside the storm, you can actually understand the storm. You are not rushing to fix it. You are not distorting it just to make it easier to survive. You are simply seeing it as it is. And from that position, something very important becomes obvious. People have always shown who they are, consistently, repeatedly. The complexity was never in their behavior. The complexity was in how much she tried to interpret it in the most generous possible way. Detachment removes that filter. It allows her to take people at face value without turning it into judgment or emotion, just information. If someone consistently shows through actions that they are only present when it suits them, then that becomes data, not a debate, not a story to rewrite, just a pattern to understand. And based on that pattern, she naturally adjusts how much access she gives, not out of punishment, but out of accuracy. To people who benefited from her confusion, this will always look like hardness, but it is not hardness. It is clarity. And clarity always feels uncomfortable to those who are used to being understood without having to be consistent. There is also something important to understand about what happens in other people when this shift begins. When she stops over-explaining, when her emotional availability becomes selective, when she is no longer instantly reachable in the same way, people do not always respond calmly. In many cases, they react. Sometimes it is subtle, a comment that brings up guilt, a tone that suggests she is changing in a bad way, a reminder of who she used to be, delivered like concern, but carrying pressure underneath it. Sometimes it is timing, the sudden emergency, the unexpected crisis, the emotional intensity that appears right when she begins to pull away. This is not random. It is what happens when a dynamic begins to change. When someone who was emotionally available all the time becomes less available, the system resists that change. People often try to restore what they had access to, not always consciously, but through behavior, through emotion, through pressure. And in those moments, something even more confusing can happen for her, because she might see brief changes, more attention, more softness, more effort, just enough to look like transformation, just enough to make her question whether she was wrong to step back. But what is actually happening in many cases is not deep change. It is stabilization behavior. It is the system adjusting temporarily to regain balance, not because the underlying pattern has changed, but because the access is being lost. And understanding that distinction is crucial, because one keeps her stuck in hope, the other brings her back to reality. It's a pattern of just enough change to pull the system back into place without ever truly changing the system itself. And when she has done enough inner work, the empath begins to recognize this difference with real clarity. She can feel when someone is genuinely evolving, and she can feel when someone is adjusting their behavior temporarily just to regain access to her. That kind of discernment becomes one of the most important psychological turning points in her life, because it protects her without forcing her into emotional shutdown or suspicion. She does not have to assume everyone is performing. She simply observes over time, patiently, quietly, consistently. And when the behavior eventually returns to its usual baseline, as it always does with temporary adjustment, she doesn't panic or overreact. She just notices it. She updates her understanding of that person internally, and she moves accordingly. There is no argument, no emotional collapse, no demand for acknowledgement. just a quiet correction in how much of herself she continues to offer. That shift from reaction to observation is a completely different way of moving through relationships. Before, any drop in effort would have felt personal. It would have triggered self-blame, overgiving, and emotional exhaustion. This time, it feels like recognition, like clarity finally matching experience, something like, yes, this is what has always been happening. And from there, she continues forward. The final stage of this transformation is the one that happens without explanation. There is no announcement, no dramatic ending, no final speech designed to make everything understood. She simply stops showing up in the places where showing up has meant losing herself over time. She stops initiating conversations that were never truly mutual. She stops maintaining relationships that only stayed alive because she kept feeding them. She stops performing emotional upkeep in dynamics that were never balanced to begin with. And the absence she creates is powerful in a way words never were. Because when someone has been consistently present for a long time, their presence stops being noticed consciously. It becomes part of the background of other people's lives, expected, assumed, invisible in its reliability. And then when it is gone, the impact is not just emotional, it is structural. People begin to notice what she was actually holding, the emotional weight she carried without complaint, the gaps she filled without being asked, the effort she made to keep things stable that others never had to think about. And that realization arrives all at once, not through explanation, but through absence. That absence communicates something more precise than any conversation ever could. It quietly makes one thing clear. She was fully there, consistently present, and it was taken for granted until it wasn't. And now something has changed. Not in anger, not in punishment, but in standard. There is no return to the old dynamic. If anything continues, it will exist on a completely different foundation, or not at all. She does not need to say it. The change already says it for her. And underneath all of this, the real transformation is not about becoming less loving. It is about becoming more accurate in how love is given. Because love without discernment slowly turns into depletion. Love without direction becomes self-erasure. Love that is given everywhere, without awareness of where it is landing, eventually stops nourishing anyone, including the one giving it. But when she begins to reclaim her energy, when she learns to pause instead of over-explain, when she chooses silence over constant repair, something essential returns to her. Her presence becomes real again, not automatic, not obligated, not performed, but conscious, chosen, and grounded. She is no longer giving from exhaustion. She is giving from clarity. And that changes everything about how it feels, both for her and for the people who truly value her. Because being met by someone who has learned to value themselves is a different kind of experience entirely. It is steady, it is honest, it does not collapse itself to stay accepted, and it does not overextend itself to stay loved. It simply exists with awareness. And when you reach that point, there is no dramatic announcement that marks it, no external validation that confirms it. You recognize it in something quieter, a moment of stillness where you would have once chased, explained, or overgiven. And now you don't. You just sit with the silence. And instead of fearing it, you understand it, not as emptiness, but as the beginning of something more grounded than anything you knew before. In the end, this entire journey is not about becoming distant, cold, or disconnected from people. It is about becoming honest with yourself in a way that no longer requires self-abandonment to maintain connection. It begins with confusion, where care is automatic and overgiving feels like love. Then comes exhaustion, where you start to realize that not all of what you carried was ever yours to hold. From there, awareness grows, and with it, the ability to see patterns clearly without needing to emotionally distort them just to stay comfortable. What follows is not a collapse, but a reorganization. Guilt appears because old conditioning always resists change. Silence replaces over-explaining. Observation replaces reactivity. And slowly, you begin to relate to people based on what they consistently show, not what you hope they could become. Some connections fall away, some change shape, and some reveal their real foundation for the first time only when you stop over-functioning inside them. And through all of this, something important returns. your energy, your clarity, and your ability to be present without being consumed. The final realization is simple but powerful. Love is not meant to erase you. Care is not meant to exhaust you. And connection is not meant to require your disappearance in order to survive. So what remains is a quieter kind of strength, one that does not chase, does not over-explain, and does not abandon itself to be understood. It simply sees clearly, chooses wisely, and stays fully present only where presence is truly met. And in that clarity, there is no loss of love, only the end of love that costs you yourself.